Before we finish up for morning tea, we're going to be hearing from Chief Wilton Littlechild, who is the Truth and Reconciliation Commission for Canada. And we're also going to be hearing from a panel about truth-telling, the unfinished business, and that is going to be chaired by Professor Marcia Langton. And I will just take a very short moment, if I can, to introduce the Chief, who we are just delighted to have here today. He has the distinction of being the Treaty First Nation person to acquire his law degree from the University of Alberta, and he has also got a Doctor of Laws degree for his outstanding achievements, including leadership in human rights, contribution to the world of sport, and representation of Indigenous peoples in the international community. Chief Littlechild has a master's degree in physical education. He has been in the Senior Games and World Masters Games, mainly in hockey, swimming, and in the triathlon. He was honoured as the first Indigenous torchbearer of the 2010 Olympic Winter Games, as well as an ambassador for the Olympics. He has been also a Member of Parliament from 1988 to 1993 and has served on several senior committees in the House of Commons and was a parliamentary delegate to the United Nations. He has also represented North America for 2 3-year terms as the North American representative to the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. He currently serves as an expert member of the UN Expert Mechanism on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which provides advice to the UN Human Rights Council. And he is married very happily and a grandfather of many and a father of 3. So if you could please join me now in welcoming to the stage Chief Wilton Littlechild.
An totemtik. Nigaan kahkioktatam skadnao. Enanas komoyan stahe. Epe mitseti ekuta. Mioja oinohtsi. Ema mupia ngetoan. Tahtuutakat pehtahkas kinanas komauk. Eina mautsik. Kapeatsumoja anota. Taskiwak. Hey. I just bring you greetings, and first of all, good morning to each of you. I greet you in my language to acknowledge the traditional owners of these territories and also to thank the hosts for this tremendous opportunity for me and my wife to join you in this very important discussion about health. My wife, Helen, I was just thinking this morning, is probably about the 4th time after 39 years of international work she's been able to join me on a discussion about health. She's a nurse, and we've been married for 46 years. You'll hear about that a little bit in my story about how important she's been to my life. So thank you, Helen, for joining me. What I'd like to do is tell you about 2 parts of my life that I've been involved with. One, over a period of almost 40 years now, in about 7 minutes. The other one is about the last 6.5 years on the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada for the remainder of the time that I have with you. So very quickly, I wanted to go over the international legal framework that's there for Indigenous peoples. As you heard, I've served on the second mechanism of 4, the most recent one established at the United Nations, which is an advisory body to the Human Rights Council. It's a 5-member body, and each year, after some submissions by Indigenous delegations and states, the Human Rights Council assigns a duty to us to do research. And this past year, they assigned us a duty to study the right to health of Indigenous peoples. So we've just given this report to the Human Rights Council. It's been adopted. And what I want to do quickly is just share with you the international framework that's there on the right of Indigenous peoples to health. As you know, a research-based body, as we are, we canvass all of the general international human rights and international laws with regard to health. Then we focus specifically on the right to health of Indigenous peoples. And we've done that, in this case, looking at the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which you've heard about yesterday by the two previous keynote speakers, and also in a couple of the panels that I attended. A bit about the International Labour Organization, the ILO Convention number 169. And what have the human rights treaty bodies said about the right to health for Indigenous peoples? And what have the special rapporteurs said on the right to health of Indigenous peoples? So as you all know, I think the main article of the UN Declaration is Article 24. And Article 24 upholds the Indigenous people's right to traditional medicines and all other social and health services. And Indigenous individuals have an equal right to the enjoyment of physical and mental health. That's the main article of the UN Declaration, but recently at the World Conference, the first World Conference on Indigenous Peoples in New York, they passed an outcome document. And in that outcome document, all the states recommitted themselves to the UN Declaration in both paragraphs 3 and 4. Article 29 is an important one, especially today, because coincidentally, as we meet, there's a World Summit going on the environment and climate change. And there's an Article 29 in the Declaration that refers to the right to conservation and protection of the environment, including the right of Indigenous peoples to prevent storage or disposal of hazardous waste on their lands. So the UN Declaration, in a way, was a forerunner to the discussions that are going on now. Article 1 of the Declaration, of course, incorporates, sorry, I'm trying to speed up here. I was at a recent conference on health, and I said, you know, my people, we have two challenges to our health. It's diabetes. I said, what? I was trying to say diabetes and obesity, and I kind of went a little too fast. So, but Article 1 incorporates all the existing international laws and applies them to Indigenous peoples. And of course, the fundamental one, the one that underpins all the other rights, is Article 3 on the right to self-determination. So you've heard about that already yesterday. The ILO Convention 169 talks about culturally appropriate health services, and also to take into account traditional health practices and the right to training and employment of local community health workers. So we have this legal framework that's there, and also now using those, what have the treaty bodies said about that? Of course, the International Covenant on Economic and Social and Cultural Rights, Article 12, restates the existing general public international right for everyone, but applies it to Indigenous peoples. The right of everyone to the enjoyment of the highest attainable standard of physical and mental health. And I have to say to you, of course, I'm very biased on the first part of that, physical health. The International Convention on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, Article 5, also refers to the requirement for state parties to ensure fulfillment of the right of everyone to public health, medical care, and social services. The Convention on the Rights of the Child recently adopted a general comment as it relates to Indigenous children. So when a state comes up for review in front of the committee, previously, when they referred to the Convention on the Rights of the Child, there was no requirement for them to focus on Indigenous children. So it was masked in a way to allow states to declare that there was really no problem with the right to health of Indigenous peoples, because there was no requirement for them to refer to it. But now there is, under general comment number 11 of the legal comment specific to Indigenous children. In paragraph 50, it urges states parties to ensure that Indigenous children are not discriminated against and enjoy the highest attainable standard of health. Now, recently, of course, there was another part of our community that was excluded, and it's the disabled persons. And for the first time in this last year at the United Nations, there was a discussion on the right of persons with disabilities to health. The treaty bodies and the special procedures also have some decisions they've made under the general area of jurisprudence. For example, they looked at the link between birth registration and access to health. They look at culturally appropriate health care. They look at, I shouldn't skip that, because there's one part of it I wanted to refer to. Somebody should ask me, why are you wearing that? Ask me, somebody. Oh, I'm glad you asked that, because for the first time this year, after an effort of 38 years, we had our first World Indigenous Peoples Games, traditional games, and this is one of the medals of that. See, culture, in our case now, can be viewed as treatment through traditional games, sports, preventing illness. So other bodies like the Committee on Elimination of Racial Discrimination, the Committee on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, have also commented on the right to health specific to Indigenous peoples. Recently, as I said, now we're making the link between environmental degradation and Indigenous peoples' health. So the Human Rights Committee and ECOSOC have both commented on that. So CERD, CEDAW have both commented on it. The Special Rapporteur on the Right to Health also wrote in one of his reports the need for Indigenous peoples to have access to culturally appropriate healthcare services and facilities, and recommends training programs for health professionals, diabesity, recommends training programs for health professionals in the Indigenous languages and cultures. The Rapporteur on the Right to Indigenous Peoples have also commented when she said that there's disproportionate representation. Of course, you all know this yourself, being the experts. The disproportionate representation of Indigenous peoples in poor health statistics globally. And I noted in your program that you've begun a study on this last year, and I think are reporting on it soon. The discrimination against Indigenous cultures, where the traditional medicines are devalued by others. We have in our country a treaty right to health, and I remember the discussion yesterday about two aspects of your efforts, one of which was to try and get a treaty for yourself here. Well, we have one under Treaty 6, and it's called the Medicine Chest Clause, and it's been there since 1877. Indigenous people's perspective, we found out in the study that we did, really have this perspective that's unique, and that the right to self-determination underpins, as I said earlier, the right to health, and really all other rights. And that Indigenous peoples, as you all know, have a holistic perspective on health, in that not only is it about physical and mental health, but also culturally and spiritually. Very important, the spiritual aspect of health. And that rather than not only just to treat illness, to prevent illness and promote wellness, which I see this conference is doing, and also the importance of Indigenous knowledge and traditional medicines, which are solutions focused. So that's one part of the story. The second part is the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada. Like Megan said yesterday, it's very hard to see. Is someone keeping track? They're going to give me 2-minute sign or something to my time. As you know, in Canada, we recently concluded the Truth Commission. This was established because some people who were still alive that suffered these consequences of residential schools finally said, that's enough. We're going to sue. We're going to sue the governments and the churches for what happened to us in residential schools. So actually, almost 15,000 lawsuits were launched in Canada by former students of residential schools. And the courts, in their wisdom, I think, actually called the parties together and asked them, can you settle this out of court? And after many months of negotiations, the survivors finally said, yes, we will. We'll settle this out of court on 4 conditions. One is that there must be a foundation established for healing. Secondly, a compensation package voluntarily for those who went to residential school and want to be compensated for that experience. The third element was for those that suffered severe physical and mental, and worst of all, sexual abuse, had a separate process for settlement. The fourth condition was the survivors said, we would have had a chance to tell our story in court, but since we're settling out of court, we want a truth commission to be established, truth and reconciliation. So that was the fourth commission, and people were asked to apply for position as commissioners. And of course, I didn't apply. I thought maybe the reason I gave was I was too busy doing my work anyway. So the first set of commissioners all resigned. And then a second call went out. Again, people were asked. They kept phoning me and asking me if I would be willing to put my name in. And they said, well, it's only part-time. Oh, okay. Put my name in the hat, I said. So I didn't hear from anyone for quite a while. And one morning I was sleeping in Geneva at the UN, and my phone rang. And a young woman said, Mr. Littlechild. I said, yes. Am I bothering you? She said, well, yeah, it's 2:00 in the morning, and I was sleeping. She said, well, the minister is going to make an announcement, a national press conference, to name the new commission, and you're one of the 3. Do you have anything to say? Well, I said, well, not really. Oh, by the way, she said, it's full-time. Click. So I was in. What could I say or do? But it's been such a blessing for me to serve on this commission. We asked the then sitting Governor General Michael Jean to consider launching us in a new start. So she did that at Rideau Hall, and she became our first honorary witness. Because in our tradition as an honorary witness, you're asked to share your experience with others in your circle of influence. So before we went to work, we called in some survivors of these residential schools. And we said to them, how should we do our work? One of the first things they said was, of course, to be culturally appropriate. When the 3 of us sat together and we talked about this work, we asked each other, why are you doing this? We decided that among the 3 of us, that this is actually a sacred trust. People are going to come forward and they're going to trust you with their story. Because many told us, I've been hiding this story for 40 years or 50 years. My children don't know what happened to me in residential school. So these survivors, who are the owners of the commission, and we say that because the survivors funded the commission. It wasn't the government or governments in Canada. The survivors themselves said, take $60 million of the settlement and establish a truth commission. But before you listen to anyone, they said, make sure there's a blanket of safety around that individual. Make sure there's a medical support available immediately. Make sure there's cultural support, and make sure there's spiritual support around that individual, because you might re-traumatize people. They said it must be safe. So we did that on their advice. We had 77 communities who invited us to come to their community and hold public hearings. And the courts also said to us, you must hold 7 national events. This commission was unique, as I said, for 3 reasons. One, it's the first one in the world that asks about children. What happens to children when you take them away from their parents and put them into an institution for 10 months out of the year, sometimes not being able to go home at all during the year, as we heard yesterday? What happens to the parents from whom you've taken the children? And some of them told us, for example, that it was too painful for them to tell us. So the national events were designed in a way to publicly educate Canada. It's been said that this is the saddest, darkest, most unknown history in Canada, what happened in residential schools. So for over 240 days, we heard individuals. 7,000 approximately came forward and shared their story with us. It's been called a national crime, but it's also been called the most extensive consultation process in Canadian history, where we heard people come forward, 2/3 of whom said, tell my story in public, and others said, no, keep it private. So part of our work to keep it culturally relevant during the national events is we took one of the sacred teachings in our culture as a theme. And the first one, of course, is about respect. Courage. We heard about that yesterday in one of the presentations by Mr. Jackson. Courage and what it takes to live up north, to survive in some of these schools in the isolated community. The one I thought would be most difficult as a theme was the one about love. You see, many times we heard from adults in a children's voice, sometimes crying in pain or anger, to tell us about not knowing anything about love. You see, when we were taken away from our parents, they said, that's when the familial bond and the experience of love was cut off. We don't know what love is. We know a lot about punishment, but we don't know what love is. I can't, for example, many times people would say to us, I hate myself. I hate that my skin is brown. Being told many, many times that you're not going to end up to amount to anything. But then the tide turned in a sense when one of the people said, you know, on my healing journey, now I can get up in the morning and look in the mirror and say, I love you. I can look to my partner, my wife, or my husband and say to them, I love you. I can tell my children something I never, ever could do before. I love you. So this emotion was taken from children and had such a disastrous impact in our country. Then we went to truth and humility and honesty and wisdom as teachings for these hearings. We had over 155,000 register for the national events. We know from numbers that's the number, but we know there's been more. There's one hearing in Edmonton where the maximum capacity in the building was 9,000, and we knew we had much more than that, and I hope there's no fire marshals in here to hear me say that. We went to people that couldn't come to us, so we had regional events. Importantly, we had a little girl at one meeting in Montreal. A little voice said, and I heard this, I'm mad. I'm angry. I'm looking out in the audience. I'm trying to spot where is she speaking from. There was a little girl the height of one of the chairs holding a microphone. And she said, why didn't I learn this in school? Why has this not been told to me? So it caused us to rethink our approach. So we set up education days during our hearings. And we had over 14,000 children come and listen to survivors. Old man said, I want my story to be told so the world knows, he said. So 68 countries actually followed us because all our hearings were on webcast. We know there was over 250,000 sites, but we don't know how many people, of course, were at each location. When we asked ourselves, what do we do now that we're finished? This was before finishing. We said we should ask others to carry the story forward about how they were impacted. So we asked former prime ministers, auditor generals, lieutenant governors, governor generals, successful business people, successful athletes, Holocaust survivors, different people who had an experience or had not had this experience to come forward and share with us during sessions like this, listening, and then telling others how they were impacted. So they're out there now. We started with an interim report in early 2012 after we started hearing stories. And we quickly concluded in a chapter, They Came for the Children, how this policy was an admitted, stated policy by the Prime Minister of Canada when he apologized to the students. The purpose of this policy was to kill the Indian in the child. To kill the Indian in a child. So how do you do that? Well, we heard stories of 4-year-old girls having pins stuck on their tongue because they spoke their language. I went to school. My grandpa couldn't speak a word of English, and he couldn't write or read English. So I went there only knowing Cree. One man said, you know, I went to the school not knowing English, and I came out not knowing Cree. You see, things were done to you as a student. So when they came for the children, sometimes they came in cattle trucks or airplanes, boats, different ways, horse-drawn buggies. We report this because it was a direct assault, we said. The policy was a direct assault on our languages, our cultures, our families, and our communities. So when the Prime Minister apologized, he indicated that this was a most harmful policy and it should have never happened. We were concerned that this story could be denied in the future, so we had commemoration projects established. We were told by the courts to establish a national research center. So there's one established after a competitive process at the University of Manitoba, where all the stories we've gathered about the truth. As I said, some people couldn't tell us orally. But they said, I'll sing you a song, and in that song, you'll hear my story. Or I'll do a poem, I'll do a book, I'll do a video or a tape. I'll do it in a theater. There's even a national ballet now going across the country on residential schools. Early on, one man challenged me and said, what makes you think you're going to believe my story? I've told my story 7 times and nobody believes me. So it caused us to do a publication in the Survivor's Voice called The Survivors Speak. So what have we learned about this? What have we learned about what happens to the child? What happens to the parents who said to us, you know, for my family, we were used to having noise in the house. Children running around, making noise, laughing, crying, fighting sometimes, as children will do, playing, but there's noise in the home. And then for 10 months out of the year, in September each year, it was called the crying month, because that's when the children were scooped up. But for 10 months out of the year, the home was quiet. No voices of children. That's why we went to alcohol and drugs, people told us. Because of the pain of losing our children, we can't do anything about it. We can't stop them because it was legislated. This was done by law. I remember one mother saying to me as I was hearing the session by myself, "Mr. Commissioner, the last thing I remember about my child, I was hanging on to her. RCMP, the police, took one arm away. The Indian agent took the other one away. That's the last time I saw my little girl. Mr. Commissioner, you go find her," she said. So it was important that we document the survivor stories, which we did. But what have we learned from this? What were the key teachings for reconciliation from these 5 years, a mandated, court-mandated order to find out the truth of what happened? Well, actually, we saw early that there's a lot of resistance to our work. The government actually was destroying records, burning them, shredding them. We had to go to court 3 times to ask the court to order the government to turn over all the documents to us, because we were told by the court to do the complete history and story of residential schools, the impact of residential school. And we felt that we couldn't do that unless we had access to all the records. So we have 10 principles of reconciliation, and I'm going to skip over them to come back to them during the panel. So you've heard we've made 94 calls to action. You know, your research body here, I'm sure you know that the UN once did a study on a few words like recommendation, suggestion, observation, conclusion. That's the words that are used by reports usually when they're done. Then they ask the question, what is the most ignored word in these studies? Recommendation. I remember chairing one, actually, a commission on justice reform, and I only issued 8 recommendations. Usually they're 300 or 400. Before I did the study, I asked myself, I wonder how many have been done actually on the justice system in Canada about Indigenous peoples. And there were 33 studies, over 3,000 recommendations, and yet we were filling the prisons. Why was that? Well, they were put on shelves to gather dust because, another report, recommendations, okay, now we've done it, let's move on. We felt that it was important now to stop that and say, studies have been done, enough studies. What we need is action. So in this commission, we're going to call for action. So we made 94 calls to action in our study. We were not told by the court to do a study on missing children, but we heard enough of it early on to say, maybe we should look at this. What happened to the children that never came home once they were taken for school? What happened to them? If they died, where did they die? How did they die? When did they die? What school did they die? What graveyard were they in? So we did a study on that, and I remember a picture is etched in my mind of 4 little boys huddled together, frozen to death, because they tried to run away from school. We heard school stories about being taken from home and put in a school 2,500 miles away from home. How are you going to run away from the school, from the abuse, the sexual abuse, when you're that far away from home? I was only 3 miles from home. I wasn't able to go home Christmas time, summertime, Children were all going home, but some of us had to stay. So in order for some to try and deal with this abuse that they were suffering, they tried to run away from school. So we did a story on that. We captured that. We have over 4,300 children now identified where they died, how they died, where they're buried. Because families in our tradition, we have to have a wake for 4 nights when someone dies. We sing 16 songs, traveling songs for the spirit, their journey. We have a feast after the funeral. So families couldn't do this when they didn't know where their child was. But now we've got at least 4,300 names, and it's ongoing. Someone told me recently there's now as high as 6,000 children have been located. So families can put closure to that. We talk about the legacy, the issues from the residential school history, the impacts in the areas that we heard most about, education. You see, it was education that got us into this mess. When the government hired 4 main churches to run these schools for the purpose, stated purpose, to civilize and Christianize us. But also, very importantly, sometimes I think more importantly, is education that'll get us out of this mess. Now that we know what happened, what do we do with that truth? Well, we take it and we shape reconciliation in the areas of education, culture, and languages. We asked one man, what would reconciliation look like to you? And he said, just give me my language back. Just give me my language back. Oh no, he said after, just give me half of my language back and I'll be happy. Culture is now being considered as treatment. People say to us, I'm now beginning to heal. You see, I thought it was very difficult to ask people to tell you the truth and then immediately go to reconciliation. It's a process, it's a spectrum actually. Yes, it's important to know the truth. Actually, there is a right to truth. You have a human right to truth about what happened to you and why. An apology was given by the Prime Minister, as it was here. But the important missing step was the forgiveness. An opportunity for survivors to forgive whoever for what happened to them. Then people said, you begin to feel a sense of justice. And as Megan Davis said yesterday, then you begin to heal. After that, you can go to reconciliation. So it's a spectrum. I think that's important. We were punished for trying to exercise any kind of cultural manifestation, spirituality. I like your theme, for example, that talks about identity. Because in our case, it was taken away from you as a child. The first day of school, if you had long braids, traditional braids, they were cut off. If you had traditional clothing, it was taken. Your name was taken. My name was taken. The name I got to replace it was number 65. 65, pick up that pen, you dummy. 65, why did you do this? So when you do that to a little child, what happens to them? Well, you all know that self-identity, your self-esteem, your pride in who you are is severely damaged. So for many years, my name was number 65. Spirituality, our cultural and spiritual ceremonies were outlawed. By law, we couldn't do a Sundance. For many, many years, people actually went into hiding. Just like they hid their children. When the authorities came, they would hide under the table in the bush. Because you see, if they tried to protect them, and many did, they were put in prison for protecting their child. We talk about health and the consequences of this history on the health of our people. injustice and governance, poverty, the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. We called for a public inquiry, and I'm very happy now that there is an inquiry going on in Canada on this issue. When I raised the issue at the United Nations many years ago, and I know one is too many, but back then the number was 250. Right after I spoke, Indigenous women came to me from Mexico, and they said, that's happening to us too. So then the numbers grew. After a national study by the police, the RCMP, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police in Canada, they have over 1,200 names of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. But we know it's higher because some families are still hoping and praying that their child, their auntie, mother, will come back someday. But there's an inquiry going on that. Child welfare, we concluded with that because this was about child apprehension. But today, actually, when we started our work in Alberta, the child apprehension rate was 68% of those apprehended were Indigenous children. When we finished, it's gone up to 69, 70%. So this phenomena that happened in the early days of children being removed from their parents, still going on today. So we talk about that in our report. And we talk about reconciliation. We make some calls specific to health. And I only have time for one of these, and I think it's important that we called on all the governments to acknowledge that the current state of Aboriginal health in Canada is the direct result of previous Canadian policies, like the residential school policy. So we call for actions on health. The Chief Justice of Canada talked about this recently. The most glaring blemish on Canadian historic records relates to the treatment of First Nations that lived here at the time of colonization. Children were taken from their parents and sent away to residential schools where they were forbidden to speak their native languages, forced to wear white man's clothing, forced to observe Christian religious practices, and not infrequently subjected to sexual abuse. In the buzzword of the day, assimilation, in the language of the 21st century, cultural genocide. This is what the Supreme Court Chief Justice said recently. This is my school. 11 years of my life, I was in that school. At one time, it was the largest residential school in Canada. In the main building, you'll see at the top floor was where the nuns lived. And the second floor, don't ask me how I know this, is the girls' dorm. The third floor after that is the classrooms. And the basement is where the dining hall was. And the building beside it was the boys' dorm, the same thing. But 7 of my sisters lived in that dorm as I went to school with them. Today, I don't know them. I know their names, but I don't know them as a sister. Because we were separated, and we weren't allowed to talk to each other. This is the same school, but from a different angle, and I'm sorry, I don't think you can see there's a fence in front of the school. And people say, I'll get over it. Well, it was a barbed wire fence. And people say, well, so what? Actually, it was an electric fence. There's a fence in front of that school that kept me and my classmates in that school, not being able to go home to see my grandmother, for months. But yet, we still have hope, because the conclusion of our work as a commission is really just the beginning of reconciliation. And it's going to require the leadership and sustained effort of all levels of government. And I know you had that here. I heard a presentation yesterday about the status of reconciliation since you've had your commission. Reconciliation will require the continuous efforts of Indigenous and public leaders working together. It's going to take all of us working together, going forward on this journey of reconciliation. So the key to the learnings, and the next topic on the panel, unfinished business of reconciliation or truth-telling. I'm going to share with you what were the main teachings. One of them is that the UN Declaration is like an eagle. UN Declaration on one wing, and for us a treaty on the other wing. It takes both wings for the eagle of reconciliation to fly so that we can have the good tomorrow. Thank you. Thank you.